Hiya, welcome to Freedom of Expression Week in Law and Ethics. So this is week 8, I believe. So we've just come back after Easter, and I want to talk about a number of issues which relate to the general topic of freedom of expression. So strap in, and we'll crack on with these topics. But before we do that, I just want to remind you about the exam. So you've done the essay now, which is great. And the next assessment for this module is the exam, which takes place at 10 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, May the 18th, which is not too far away now. So I would suggest you start thinking about that. It's an online exam. It's open book, which is can lure some people into a false sense of security, and you think you don't need to revise because you think, oh well, I can have McNays open. That's true, you will be able to have McNays open, but it's a 90-minute exam, so you'll have 90 minutes to answer all the questions. And if you don't have a good basic knowledge of the law, you're going to struggle to look up every answer in McNays. So I strongly recommend you revise as normal for this exam, and then you can always just use McNays if you just need to top up on something. But I think if you try and go into it unprepared, you will struggle. The important thing to say about this exam, apart from the fact that it's really important, is it's particularly important because part of the BJTC accreditation for our program, so which means you get a certificate at the end of the program to say that you've been on a BJTC accredited course. Remember, that's the Broadcast Journalism Training Council. They insist that you have to have passed a law exam, so you have to pass this exam in order to pass the module. So even if you did really well in the essay, you can't rely on the average taking you over the line. You have to pass the exam element in order to pass the module. So just remember that you need to get at least 40% in the exam. And as I say, you really do need to prepare and revise. There will be a revision session in a few weeks' time, and all of the questions we've done in the workshops are exam questions, are typical exam questions. So before you ask me, can I see some sample papers? Well, you've got lots of sample papers there already. They've just been divided up into the individual subjects, but all of the questions we look at in the workshops are typical exam questions. If you can work your way through all of those and you can do okay on those, you'll be fine in the exam. So I really strongly recommend that you do that. Go back to the very beginning in the first week and start working your way through those workshop sheets that we did. And we'll do again this week, and you will be fine. When you're dealing with the exam, remember that sort of basic structure I've suggested to you for how you answer a question. You need to be able to name the specific legislation. You need to be able to define that area of law that the question's about, and you need to be able to apply the appropriate defences within that area of law. So I would really strongly recommend that you look at each area of law with those headings in mind, and then when you come to answer the questions in the exam, you think about those headings as well. And if you do that, you should be fine. So freedom of expression. What do we mean? So the first video in this week's series is going to look at the Freedom of Information Act, really important piece of legislation that was brought in nearly 20 years ago now, and is a very useful tool for us as journalists. Then I'll move on to the next video, which will be looking at your rights of access to the courts and also how you challenge courts. And then the last video is going to look at your right as a journalist to take pictures and videos in a public place, and how do you avoid being bullied out of taking pictures by people like police officers. And I'll also just say at the very end of that a little bit about coroners' courts, because we've touched on them but we haven't said an awful lot about them yet. So hopefully this should come down into 3 videos today. Excuse me. So starting off with freedom of expression is the the two key bits of legislation which affect us is Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, the ECHR. So Article 10, which enshrines our right to freedom of expression. And then the other key piece of legislation is the Freedom of Information Act 2000. So when you're looking at what bits of legislation apply, there you go, Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights and the Freedom of Information Act 2000. Let's have a look at the Freedom of Information Act to start with, because as I said a little bit a few minutes ago, it enshrines really important tools for us as journalists. So the Freedom of Information Act, you'll hear people talking about it being called the FOI, or people actually use it in a whole range of ways, that word, to say, oh, I'm doing an FOI, or why don't we get an FOI together on something. Freedom of Information, that's the shorthand for Freedom of Information Act. So it gives anyone the right to require public authorities to disclose information that they already have but would not otherwise publish. So a couple of key things in there. You can't just ask anyone or any organisation for information under the Freedom of Information Act. It has to be a public authority, and you can't force a public authority to get information that you want but they don't have. You can only ask them to provide you with information which they have already gathered and that they wouldn't otherwise be putting out there. So public authorities and information that they've already got. And what the Freedom of Information Act says is that those public authorities, they must supply that information to you without charging for it, for the process of finding and collating that. But there are some limits, and we'll look at some of that a little bit later on. But basically, you're allowed to ask for information they've got, which they haven't published, and they've got a legal duty to provide that information. And just to stress, Freedom of Information is a really useful tool, and it provides a whole range of great stories. And here's a sample of some front pages that have been created using FOIs, Freedom of Information requests, and we'll see some more shortly. So yeah, really useful way to get information as a reporter. So I mentioned it's public authorities, so there's a whole range. There's over 100,000 public bodies which are included. They are listed specifically within the Act in a list, or a schedule, as they say in the law, listing all of those organisations. But there's some of the key ones. Things, all government departments are included. The House of Commons and the House of Lords, so all the institutions of government are included. Armed forces are included. You can put in an FOI request to the armed forces, councils, the police, fire services, health service, universities, colleges, schools, and regulatory bodies like Ofcom, which regulates broadcast, as you know, and also organisations like the General Medical Council, which regulates doctors and the medical profession. So there's loads and loads, 100,000 of them, but those are key ones. So you're getting the idea. These are the big institutions of the state, and you can ask them for information, and they are legally obliged to provide that. But there are some authorities which are not included. Some of the ones which you'd expect not to be, like the Security and Intelligence Services, or MI5, MI6, those sorts of organisations, they're not going to be forced to give you all their secrets. Things like the courts don't have to answer FOI requests. Individual MPs and peers sitting in the House of Commons and House of Lords, they don't have to provide you with individual information. Excuse me. Interestingly, IPSO is on the list of public authorities that are not included. IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation, which is the regulator for print and online, so they're not included. So there are some institutions in there which are not obliged to answer FOI requests. So it's important you understand how to make an FOI request, and what good reporters do is they quite often will have FOI requests bubbling away in the background, so that when you get to a lean day and there's not very much going on, you've got something you can be working on, so that when your news editor comes around and they say, what have you got? You can say, oh, actually, I put an FOI request a few weeks ago, and I've got all this information, so I can now pull together a story based on this information. So what do you do before you actually make that FOI request? So you need to see if the information is already published, because as mentioned in the definition, that you can only use FOI to get information that's not already out there. If you put in an FOI request for something that's already out there, you'll probably just get a fairly terse response saying, see this link, or it's already out there, and it's up to you to find it. So you need to do your research first. Is it something that's not already out there? You need to be quite specific. You can't just put in an FOI request to a council and say, tell me everything you know. Because it's just not specific enough, and if they did that, you would end up with so much information that you wouldn't be able to pick your way through it, and also it would bust outside of those cost constraints which I mentioned earlier on, that they don't have to provide information if the request is so large that it would take up a huge amount of time and cost a lot of money to produce. So you need to work out what it is that you actually want. And also just worth checking with the particular organisation you're making the request to, check what their publication scheme is. They should have a thing called a publication scheme, because under the Freedom of Information Act they're obliged to do that, and they should have a particular person who coordinates their freedom of information details. So it's worth trying to find that person and have a conversation with them, explain what sort of information you want and how it would what the best way of presenting your request. Yeah, worth identifying that person. But once you make an FOI request, first thing is it must be in writing. You can't just ring up and make it verbally. You have to put an FOI request in writing. You must be really specific about exactly what information you want. So you need to be very specific in terms of the scope of that information, the time scale of that information, etc. And if it's for a large amount of information, you should think about breaking it up into a number of smaller requests. So a classic example perhaps would be if you want to find out what the most high-earning speed camera is in Greater Manchester. So that would give you a good story if you could find that. You could tell people this particular camera is, the one that earns most money for the local authority. Well, if you just said, I want to know how many speeding fines have been issued by every speed camera across Greater Manchester, you would pretty soon you would get a response saying, well, that's too big a request. It would cost too much, take too much time to collate that information. You need to be more specific. So what you might do is you might say, okay, I realise I need to break this down by each city or borough. So you might put in an FOI request for Salford and for Manchester and for Bolton and Bury and Tameside, and break it down by area to start with. And you then might say, well, I also want this is still quite large, each of those, so you need to put a time constraint on it. So for each of those, you might put in an FOI request, say, I would like to know the revenue generated by the cameras in this area between 2010 and 2020. They may come back to you and say, well, 10 years is too much. So you could then break down your request further and say, well, I'd like to have a breakdown of revenue in that area for 2010. And then you put in another FOI request for 2011 and then another for 2012. And that way you've broken it down into a single year for a single area. And once you've got that, then you would need to put all that together, stitch it back together again to see what the revenues were. And hopefully if you did that, you'd probably put it into a spreadsheet and you would see which was the highest earning camera in Greater Manchester in any particular year, because you'd have it broken down by year. And then you could go and obviously do pictures of that camera, see what people thought about that. And it would start to give you a decent basis for a story which would be well read. We've done that story at the Manchester Evening News, and that was always a very well read story when you show people how much each speed camera was earning. You can produce a map as well, so people can click on each speed camera and see what sort of revenue it's earning. So so in writing, be specific and break down large requests. If they come back to you and demand to know why you want to know, you don't have to explain. The legislation is very clear. The Freedom of Information Act makes it very clear that you do not have to explain why you are making this request. As long as it's a reasonable request of a public authority which is included in the list, most of them are, then they are obliged to provide you with that information within certain constraints. Sometimes you have to really fight. So I've put this link on the slide so you'll be able to read it in more detail. But basically, a journalist called Claire Miller, she put in a Freedom of Information request to a whole range of organisations about homelessness. So she had put in this FOI about homelessness to every local authority in the country in order to get the data to find out where homelessness was the worst, etc. And particularly how many deaths of homeless people were being recorded in each area. It took her, I think, in the end 2.5 years, and she had to actually go through a huge legal battle in order to demand and to win the fight to get this information released, because this was regarded as quite sensitive information by many local authorities. So, but she won because she just kept on going. She kept on coming back to the basic law that she was entitled under the Freedom of Information Act to have that information. And that 2.5 year battle ended up in a whole load of really important stories about homelessness. So that was in the Mirror, so that was a national story. But when you started breaking it down by region, all of the regional newspapers in her group, which is the Reach group, that's the Reach, which owns things like the Manchester Evening News, Liverpool Echo, etc. But that was the Cambridge homelessness. People are dying on Cambridge streets at twice the national rate. There was one for Coventry there. So Birmingham. So yeah, you can see, produced by getting that information, it produces a load of really significant, important information which help reveal the much higher death rate amongst homeless people across the country. So yeah, it can be a battle, but it can be a very worthwhile battle. The law also dictates how quickly organisations should get back to you. So if you put in your request in writing and you've been very specific about what it is you want, they need to get back to you within 20 working days. So working days, Monday to Friday, no bank holidays, etc. They can get an extension, so they can seek an extension in order to get third-party advice or to consider public interest, because there are occasions when they can refuse on a public interest. But just to be clear, that they don't have to provide you with the original documents or any particular documents. They just need to give you the information. So they might not have to give you contracts and drawings, etc. They might just give you a very dull-looking spreadsheet with numbers in there. So you need to be fairly comfortable handling and manipulating numbers if you are putting in freedom of information requests. There's a whole load of reasons why organisations may refuse to give you the information you've requested. Firstly, if they're not a public authority, they won't give it to you. If they're not a public authority on the schedule, they won't give it to you. If that organisation doesn't actually hold the requested information, even if you think they should, but if they come back and say, we don't have that information, they're not obliged to go and find it. They don't have to go and get it for you. It's only if they already have the information in their files. There are cost limits, so I mentioned a couple of times so far. So if the cost of providing that information would exceed those limits, £450 to £600 in terms of actually pulling together the information, they can say no, it'll cost too much. The way to respond to that, of course, is that you break it down and say, okay, in that case, I don't want all of that information, the revenue generated by speed cameras from 2010 to 2020. I just want the information for 2010. and then put in another one for 2011 and another one for 2012, because those limits apply to each individual FOI request. So if you break it down sufficiently, they can no longer say that the individual cost of the FOI request is too high. It is possible for them to come back and say, yeah, well, we will give you that information, but because the costs are high, we expect you to pay for it. Now, I wouldn't advise you do that, because I can't imagine many editors wanting to sign off a bill for paying for freedom of information. They'd expect you to be clever enough to work out how to get that information by breaking your request down in a different way. And that there are a range of reasons why information may be held to be exempt. I'll leave the information in slides, in the actual slides I put into Blackboard, but I'm not going to go into the full detail now. There's different types of exemptions, but we've already seen a couple of them. Things like it's state security, commercially sensitive, these sorts of reasons. They may come back to you and refuse to give you that freedom of information request to be granted. So that's available in the slides when you look at them on Blackboard if you want more information on that. But I think we've covered the key points so far. So that's freedom of information, really important tool for you as a journalist. So I'm going to end this video here and start a new one where we're going to be talking about accessing the courts and challenging the courts.